Hi, and welcome to episode number 54 of Basha's Thoughts. Today, I've been thinking about larger structures, and in particular, I've been thinking about the idea of totalitarianism. See, I enjoy thinking about big structures because then when you understand how something works on a larger scale, then you can sometimes find when you are acting within a particular system. And then when you can see that, you sometimes have the freedom of choosing something different. This is why I like bioenergetics, for instance. It's a way of looking at the different character structures that have been formed in us based on our developmental types of traumas. How these create particular types of structures that lead us to be in a particular way, react in a particular way, have particular blind spots. And when you start understanding that, then you can start seeing that this is not actually you. These are just structural reactions in you. And then you can start to become a little bit more free of them. So one of the structures that I was looking at these days was totalitarianism. And the reason for it is that it seems to me that we might actually be moving into a global totalitarian type of regime. That there is a global totalitarian movement that's going on. And so if this is true, then it might be interesting to understand what totalitarian actually is, what it tends to lead to, and also see if this is indeed what is going on right now globally. If we understand what we need in order to create a totalitarian movement, then we can see if this is what has happened. And if we understand what usually tends to happen with totalitarian movements, then we can also see how far we have come and what lies ahead of us. And of course, if we can truly understand this, then we might be able to break out of the mass hypnosis. I call it mass hypnosis. I don't know the correct word for it, but it is something akin to a mass hypnosis that happens whenever you have totalitarian movements. So, what is totalitarian, actually? I've been looking at some books. I enjoyed The Origins of Totalitarianism by Hannah Arendt. She wrote it, and it was published, I think, in 1951 as that. I think it was published even before under a different name. So she fled Germany in the 1930s, and she had great insight into what was going on at that time. In the early 1900s, we had perhaps the first large, actually, working totalitarian movements. I'm not sure. But we did have two examples of them, and one was Hitler's Germany, and the other one was Stalin's Soviet. And those two movements were very, very similar because they were both what one could say totalitarian. And before we go into all of the definitions and ideas, and let's just look at the consequences and the end result. So the end result is something that is quite terrifying, and this is why it is of interest, perhaps, to avoid if we can. And of course, you know about the concentration camps, both in those that were established by the Nazi movement and established in the Soviet Union, where people were exterminated, basically, or sometimes work camps. Some people survived, but many, many, millions and millions died. So when you look at the consequences, you see that this is something that's not interesting for us to relive. And Hannah Arendt, I don't know how to pronounce her last name actually, she finishes the book talking about that these concentration camps were actually only laboratories, because the idea is actually to do what they did in the concentration camps outside of them. But first you do it in a lab before you test it out. And so this is the fear. What if someone were to succeed in creating a new totalitarian regime and lead us into those kinds of terrifying consequences in the end? So, what is meant by totalitarian movements? It is authoritarian, a kind of dictatorship, but it is much more. A totalitarian movement is one that is created out of isolated, lonely, you could say, rootless people. And this is fundamental because this is what is required in order to create a totalitarian movement. And totalitarian means, it refers to a totality. And that is in the sense of perhaps being imperialist, of wanting more, of ultimately leading to a kind of world domination idea. So in totalitarian movements, you have an ideology that ultimately is meant to lead to some form of world domination. All right, so what is required in order to create a totalitarian movement? Well, first you need the rootless, homeless type of people who are dissatisfied, who have a high level of anxiety that is not very specific, have a high level of meaninglessness. Right now in the world, we have great movements of people. We have a lot of rootless people. And if we look at societies, even where people are supposed to have a home, are supposed to actually be living well, we find a very high degree of dissatisfaction. So these are key, essential parts in order to start from. You need to have a sense of lack of connection, a meaninglessness in what you do. And you find this if you look at jobs, for instance. How many people find that what they are doing is actually deeply satisfying and meaningful? Many will find that their actual job is not all that meaningful. And when you have a lot of people feeling that way, and when you have high levels of anxiety, which you do, high levels of isolation, which you also do in our society in general, even before COVID, well, that is a great start for a narrative. And the narrative of a totalitarian regime is based around an ideology. In a totalitarian regime, what you need is a type of propaganda that initially will lead people to start feeling a sense of meaning, a sense of self-respect, a type of rootedness. The narrative will provide a type of escape reality. It is the consistency of that system that is so attractive. So it's not something that is based on actual facts. It is based around a narrative, a story. And indeed, what you will find in totalitarian regimes is that facts are turned into purpose statements. So this has been called a defactualization. And the narrative provides a new sense of identity, meaning, and often people will be able to turn their anxieties that they felt before into just that one thing. And so they will tend to start to fight whoever is or whatever is outside of that narrative. And that will feel much better than just having undefined types of anxiety and not really having a purpose and not really feeling a sense of meaning in one's life, then this narrative of purpose that remains as a purpose, so it's not necessarily surrounded around facts or based on facts. Indeed, often it is even based on things that are counterfactual and not at all part of what we might have called reality out there, a physical type of reality. And this is the mass hypnosis that I was talking about, where a lot of people join this movement in some sense and they feel better. And this is a selfless type of movement often, so it's not around egoic types of needs. Indeed, people are prepared to even give up a lot in order to pursue this higher purpose, which has a consistent type of narrative, even though it may actually not really make sense. So before we move on, let's just look at that. Is this something we recognize from the world now? And is this something that happened in the early 1900s? Indeed, in the early 1900s, there were a lot of rootless people, and a lot of meaninglessness was present. And when crisis hits, then this is escalated. So this was the past, but it has also been our present. And of course, with COVID, we had isolations, and isolation leads to even deeper meaninglessness. So the COVID lockdowns around the world have been quite helpful in creating the right type of climate to be able to bring forth a narrative. And in order to be able to find a narrative that you can focus on and not really see anything else, it is helpful to have fear, because whenever you're afraid, your vision, so to speak, becomes quite limited. Your ability to see possible solutions becomes quite limited. And so by focusing on fear, by promoting fear in our media, for instance, and by potentiating it, we can increase the probability of people wanting to latch on to a central narrative that has to be consistent. And it's interesting because we do have a central narrative, a narrative, in fact, that has been so strong that whenever people have come up to speak up against it, they have been censored. YouTube, Facebook, the social media platforms have all been working in the same manner as the mass media, all promoting the central narrative and prohibiting, annihilating the other possible ideas around the central narrative. Our central narrative is very much like the propaganda we've seen in the past. It has certain types of slogans that are repeated over and over. And we notice that people do tend to fall into a state of hypnosis, because whenever someone says something different, it generates a strong feeling in those who are hypnotized or those who believe in the central narrative, and they start to almost fight. I remember one time saying that nitric oxide is an interesting gas, and there are studies that are going on right now to see how it affects COVID. Now, this sounds interesting. And it was so interesting for me to see that when I expressed this idea, I had a very strong backlash from people I had never expected would react in such a manner. And they were telling me that I was killing people because I was providing them an option, because I was providing them the idea, I was selling them on the idea that vaccines are not the only option, are not the only solution. It was when I started seeing these strong reactions around the central narrative that I started to ask myself, what is actually going on? Why are these people reacting in such a strong manner? And one might ask oneself, well, maybe this central narrative is just something that happened. It might resemble totalitarian types of dynamics, but it's true. Well, if you look at statisticians, now it's not easy to find information about them, but they exist. It's not easy to find information because of the censorship that we are experiencing right now. But when statisticians have looked at the numbers and compared them to the numbers that were and the models that were presented to us, even from the very beginning around COVID, all of the models pretty much were warped and aggravated. So it looked like it's so much more dangerous. So there was a lot of fear-mongering around these issues. And how does a totalitarian system organize itself? Well, if we look at the past, we had these ideas of a leader or some leaders. Then we have the sympathizers, who are the believers, the people who believe in the propaganda that is being propagated throughout society. And then you have what used to be called the party members in the past. And these were people close to the leader or the leaders, and they surrounded the leader, and they didn't actually believe in the propaganda. So the sympathizers believe in what is being told to the masses, but the party members don't actually. But they're okay because they are sold on the ideology in the sense of world domination and victory, and they have their own goals. And then it's very interesting, there's another part, there's another group, and that's something that has been called elite formations. So these are people who work on turning facts into purposes, so that every statement about a fact can actually be turned into a statement of intention or purpose, so that it falls into the narrative that is being sold. If we look at this idea of leaders and party members and then sympathizers and such, is that something that we can recognize around, let's say, the pandemic? If, say, in the US, we take Mr. Fauci as one of the leaders, who is the one who speaks to the people on the subject, and then you have people around him, and then we also go back to the idea, but maybe they're just telling us the truth. Well, we know that the truth that they're telling is warped, but not just that. We know, for instance, that several narratives that have been sold to us and propagated throughout society are most likely not true. One of them is the origin of the virus. And in the beginning, Fauci was saying that it is absolutely of natural origin, and there is absolutely no indication whatsoever of anything else. While at the same time, in his emails to his party members or the inner circle, it was clear that he and the others knew that this was a lie. It was only a propaganda that was meant to be sent out to the masses. And so we see a similar type of organization that we find in the previous totalitarian regimes. However, there are differences as well. Before, we had Germany or the Soviet Union, but now we have a totalitarian movement that is across the world. And when you are in this movement and you follow the central narrative, then you also start to fight the opposition very vehemently. You are against the people who, for instance, for some reason choose not to be vaccinated because that is the only solution. And vaccination, even if it is with an experimental type of drug, well, then you have to sacrifice yourself for the better of all. And it is only egoic people who think only about themselves who are in the other group. And we start moving against them. A totalitarian regime requires an enemy, cannot survive without an enemy. This can be an internal enemy or an external enemy. In the end, in the totalitarian movement, facts are irrelevant. What matters is purpose. And there is a felt sense of purpose, a felt sense of purity, meaningfulness, and we're moving towards it, and it feels good because we also disconnect from our previous anxieties, and so we do feel better in the moment. Another interesting part is that this is indeed a movement, so it needs to keep on moving. It needs to mobilize people and keep on mobilizing people. In the past, this meant, for instance, to exterminate all Jews. It's interesting because it wasn't just Jews in Germany, it was all Jews. It is a totalitarian movement, so we wish to do something that is global or totalitarian, total. And so it started by attacking Jews. Then it needed to continue, so it attacked half Jews. But then it needed to go on, so it started to attack sick people. And it started to attack intellectual-looking people, so people who wore glasses were attacked, and so on. So for this movement to work, it has to maintain a permanent instability. So there cannot be a new normal. This is something that we hear a lot. We hear that we want to go back to the world as it was before. And some people say we don't want to go back to that world. We want to find a better world. So we're always talking about a new normal, and yet, so far, the movement is helping us to not quite find what this new normal, stable regime would be. The totalitarian regimes also usually have a secret police, and the secret police first deals with the opposition. That's in the beginning stages. And then, after, once the totalitarian rule is set up, the aim is domination through terror. And it's interesting that it's set up so that this is outside of the traditional penal system. Is that something that we recognize in any way? Well, the vaccines, the current experimental vaccines are set up so that the companies that make them cannot be held responsible for them. So there are already all sorts of exceptions outside of the traditional penal system. And there are different phases that are described in the Origins of Totalitarianism. The first is to destroy the civil rights of a whole population. And this is to make them feel stateless, homeless, increase anxiety. And this is something that we have seen, for instance, in the United States ever since 9/11, the erosion of rights. Then the next idea is to start killing the moral person. And so martyrs, for instance, become impossible. You no longer have access to them, so you cannot see any of those kinds of actions. And in the social media, we have seen a lot of censorship. So we do not have access to a lot of information that is highly relevant to what is actually going on, that could help us wake up from the hypnosis. And then the next part, the final one, is the killing of the individual and their dignity, their decency, reducing them to something that is not considered quite human anymore. And this is what was going on in the concentration camps. And these have been considered laboratories where we can start to see what this may actually look like before we go out and apply it to the world. Kind of scary. This is from the book. But what is the problem? Well, the problem is that if this type of dynamics is what is actually being played out right now, then we do not have beautiful things to look forward to within this context. If this is what we are seeing, but not as Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union, but now a global totalitarian type of regime, then before we used to have, for instance, in the Nazi propaganda, they used anti-Semitism, and so we pointed out the Jews as the problem. Right now, what we're doing is we're pointing to, for instance, the unvaccinated as the problem. They are the ones who are causing everyone else to suffer because they are preventing us from getting herd immunity. They are keeping the virus alive in society, just like the Jews were, according to the Nazi propaganda. We need to seclude and eliminate them. Just like the Jews, let's put them in ghettos. Let's identify. Let's have everyone who is not vaccinated carry something so that we can see and stay away from them. That was the beginning for the Jews. The problem is that the more we fall under the mass hypnosis and the narrower our vision becomes as a result of it, the more and more horrendous types of things, actions we can actually commit. And so the next step and the one after that can be quite terrifying. And history shows us that this is the dynamics that is going on right now. And in the past, this has led to the extermination of millions of people. And that is why it's interesting to note and to see, because perhaps this way we can start to wake up from it so that we do not fall prey and so that we do not become the mob that starts killing off others. But there's also a positive part to this. See, so far it looks like The totalitarian systems pretty much self-destruct in the end. They have to. They cannot perpetually mobilize people. It doesn't work. And so hopefully this global totalitarian movement that we're seeing right now is something that will self-destruct quickly before we get too deep into it and before we start doing horrendous things to the world population. What can we do? We can learn to try to recognize whenever totalitarian types of dynamics are starting to arise, so that we don't fall prey as easily to the central narrative. That's one thing we can do. This is a little bit like the idea of who we identify with or what we identify with. And by seeing that that is not us, we become free. So by seeing the dynamics, it is easier to not fall prey to them, even though in the moment it might feel better to be in one group of people and to be able to direct our anger at another group and to have such great clarity, which is something that we have been longing for, because in our current world it is quite difficult to know what is true, what is actually going on. The way our media work right now and social media, it becomes increasingly difficult for us to make sense of what's actually going on. And so having a clear central narrative becomes a relief. But knowing about this, we can start to choose differently. Another way of snapping out is actually to find an even greater threat. And this is a little bit what I'm talking about. If we realize the threat that totalitarian actually poses as compared to, say, the unvaccinated or whatever other narrative might be going on, then we can snap out of that hypnosis. The problem is that then we will probably latch onto another narrative if we can find one. And so the best way I see is to stop identifying with them and to free ourselves from them in that manner, ever going deeper and deeper inside and finding who we truly are. This is a road that is beautiful. It is something that leads us to deep satisfaction, meaningfulness, meaningful interactions with others, a greater sense of love. It satisfies us in all sorts of ways and helps prevent us from falling prey to ideas that have to do with totalitarianism and other types of not so positive dynamics. So that was it for today. I might talk to you in another podcast episode. Take care.